Welcome. This is Professor TOVANCHE, and we are, as you can see, about to embark on a really important part of our history, the 60s. We'll be talking about the civil rights boom and the rise of Black power. Now, I should just really quickly say these slides that you're about to see, I'm afraid that this might be a little choppy. I'm going to do my best. A lot of this material comes from my traditional history courses when I deal with civil rights in the second part of the U.S. history survey. Um, the 60s and civil rights is a really, really broad topic, um, dealing with lots of different issues. And of course, what I'm trying to do here is sort of encapsulate or focus on the Black experience. Although when I talk about these things in my regular class in the 60s, um, and civil with the 60s and civil rights, I in fact talk about how it is a very broad-based movement. You'll get a sort of taste for that, but in having to sort of tailor those lectures to this course, I've had to move some things around. I think it's going to be a little bit choppy. Sorry if that is, but you will have the material that you will need in order to take the test. And of course, you will have the material that you need in order to learn about what we're supposed to be learning about here. Okay. Okay, so let's launch into this. We're talking about civil rights, right? Now, it's interesting because the civil rights movement is not only broad-based but long-standing. We've seen some various turning points in history where people are fighting for their rights. If you're talking about civil rights being a fight for equality, then in fact, it's always been going on. The 60s, we know, is this era where you're going to see a particular boom in civil rights, but we've always seen this. We've been seeing it from the very beginning, whether it was the slave rebellions, Nat Turner and so forth, whether it was that to fighting, Black men fighting in the American Revolution before that, or fighting in the Civil War after that. There are all these instances in which Black folk have been fighting for equal rights. The 60s, though, of course, we set that apart as something different, something special. And it is a massive, massive turnaround. So we have to give it its place. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there were some turning points even before that. In fact, the modern civil rights movement probably it's probably founded best, or we should say that it's founded on what happened with the world wars, especially World War II. We're talking about the war periods, World War I and II, where there was migration to cities, both white and Black, we know that, but there were many, many changes as we've talked about. Of course, after the war, we see Truman integrating the military. We see people of color actually, generally, but we talked about Black people. We talked about how they were demanding social change. They have this new consciousness. There's a greater understanding of themselves, and even white observers have a greater understanding, maybe even a greater appreciation for their struggle. We know that the Black community comes out of World War II emboldened, a new sense of belonging. They had fought and they had died, and therefore they wanted something else. Their community had lost men. They demand something else. We also saw how economic conditions have improved appreciably, at least, because of things like the GI Bill and the booming economy. We know that these were limited with regard to Black folk, but in fact, we do see their boats sort of rising. All of these all of these changes that are happening in the wake of World War II are important. They're like I said, they're going to lay the basis for further change. Not only are we seeing economic change and ideas of social change, but we're seeing political activism. We're seeing how a lot of people after World War II, a lot of Black folk are engaging in political, not just political speech, but political activism, voting, making change, talking about making change, fighting in U.S. courts for their rights. So World War II is this massive, massive turning point. It's a very exceptional turning point. All of this is the basis for the modern civil rights movement, which will explode in the 1960s. Well, the 60s, let's put it that way, the 60s. When we talk about the 60s, We often think, okay, 1960 to 1969, but that's not really what that means. As historians, we will tend to view a particular era that is marked by certain factors or characteristics and call it, give it a name. So, in a sense, the 60s didn't really start in 1960 and certainly did not end in 1969. If I were to place if I were asked to place sort of these bookends in terms of dates, when did it start, when did it end, the 60s, I would say it's actually starts somewhere in the mid 1950s and ends in the early 1970s. See, we're talking about an era. The 60s was marked by conflicts over social divisions, it was marked by conflicts over ideologies, right? Different ways of thinking. The 60s were marked by a growing sense of rights consciousness. This idea that people have rights and that that they don't just have them, they deserve them and they should be fighting for them. This growing sense of rights consciousness is not just about Black people. It's certainly about people of color, sure, generally, not just Black folk, but also brown people and others. It's also about youth, women, people of a different sexual orientation. So when we talk about the 60s, here's where all of these different streams and struggles of different kinds of people that I've sort of alluded to in other lectures, all of these things come to a head right here. Now, the 60s, in a sense, will begin, I think, with a very important Supreme Court case called Brown v. Board of Education, which you've probably heard of. Brown v. Board of Education is going to be a Supreme Court case that is decided in 1954. Of course, with all of the background that we've talked about. With all the background change, right, that we talked about, economic, political, social, all that stuff is going on. But still, in the 1950s, the Supreme Court is going to have to step in because what's going on is in the 1950s still, many, many states require segregation in public schools. 17 or so states require them. Almost all of them in the South. Washington, D.C. required it. All other states allow it, which means that throughout the country, even in the North, there are children sitting in segregated classrooms. In the South, nearly half of the children are in segregated classrooms. Most of those are at the younger levels. In fact, in a lot of places in the South, what would happen is that they would actually segregate kindergarten through about high school, and then in high school, maybe begin to integrate. Of course, that goes back to the point that I made earlier, is that children are very impressionable. And by the time they are young adults, they know their place, they know what's expected of them, they know what kind of society they live in. And so some states actually started to integrate at the higher grades, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. Not all of them did that. In fact, there's going to be a lot of people in the South who push back against any integration at all. Point is, lots of children, in fact, sitting in segregated schools, lots of problems. Basically, despite the 1950s boom, we know that half of the nation's Black families are living in poverty. We have also Latinos living in poverty, Native Americans, and a lot of poor white folk living in poverty. One of the things that my students don't recognize is that all of these groups fought for and received civil rights, even poor white people. They too benefited from the overall movement. Why? Because it was this movement that would force the government to rethink how it treats people at the bottom, and they too were at the bottom. What I'm getting at is that civil rights in the 60s, here is where all of those different struggles come together. These social forces that had simmered for centuries, all of this animosity and tensions regarding around race and color and class, all of that is going to explode in the 60s. And it's going to start, I think, with Plessy v. Ferguson. Oh, excuse me, Brown v. Board of Education, which really overturns the fundamental principle of Plessy v. Ferguson. We've talked about Plessy a lot. Plessy in 1954 is still good law, which means that as long as schools gave equal stuff, material goods, as long as they were treated equally in that sense, it was okay for schools to segregate children according to race. In Brown v. Board of Education, that principle, the principle of separate but equal, is going to actually be overturned with regard to public education. In Brown v. Board of Education, you have the NAACP bringing a bunch of different cases. There are like 4 different cases that were in fact consolidated into one and put before the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court says in an opinion that is unanimous, a unanimous opinion, it says, finally, separate but equal in public education is unconstitutional. Separate but equal. Let me just pop these all down. As I said, I'm going to be a little bit off my game, but there it is. Okay. What does this mean? What does it mean that separate but equal is inherently unequal? What the Supreme Court had been looking at all along in the decisions that we've been talking about, recall decisions involving colleges, universities, and so forth. It had actually been upholding the principle of Plessy v. Ferguson in that as long as you gave people equal stuff, you could treat them differently. But here, the Supreme Court is saying no. The very fact that you segregate children according to race in schools, the very fact that you do that is by its very nature unequal. It is inherently unequal treatment. No matter whether you give both sides the same stuff, if you segregate them by race, it is equal. It is unequal. It is unconstitutional. Why? How did the court get here? Notice 1896 was Plessy v. Ferguson. Here we are in 1954, what, almost 60 years later? Somebody else do the math. The point is, why do they do that? What's the rationale? Of course, we have to take into account everything that has come before, right? We know all of the struggles that we've seen in the right after, I mean, not just after the Civil War, but even before that, but particularly this idea of a new Negro rising in the early 20th century in the fight for inclusion with regard to World War I and World War II. We've seen all of that. The court has taken notice of that, but in the meantime, something else has happened with the court, and that is, hey, its interpretation of this of the Constitution has actually evolved. The Supreme Court does not go in and with an eraser and erase or scratch out anything with a pen on the U.S. Constitution. It will simply interpret what it sees. What's interesting is that in 1896, when Homer Plessy was forced to sit in the, quote, black car, the Supreme Court said that's okay. Separate but equal is okay. They didn't say those words, but that's really what came out of that case. But in 1954, they're going to look at a very similar situation. Segregation in public schools by race. And they're going to say, that's unequal. Why? And they're going to be looking at the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. They're going to say, look, the 14th Amendment requires a sense of equality that goes beyond material goods. That there is something beyond stuff you can touch and stuff you can hold that is important, and that the government must give these other abstract sorts of things also to the people equally. What does this mean? Here's where we start getting, in some people's minds, a little wishy-washy. One of the reasons that Brown v. Board of Education as a court case is going to be criticized, vilified, is that it relies on what some people call these soft sciences, if they're sciences at all. Psychological and sociological data. What has happened in the meantime, remember, is sociology and psychology have advanced as their own academic disciplines, scholarly disciplines. We talked about this in the early 1900s, right? When we talked about the Chicago School. Well, the NAACP that brings this case, it draws on a bunch of psychological and sociological data that argues that Black children who are segregated from white children experience low levels of self-esteem. Why is that? They bring out this famous doll experiment. And this experiment has actually been done over again. It's been replicated. You might see this on YouTube. But what they showed, what they brought to court was the fact that in these 1950s experiments, when they would show children, both white and Black children, show them dolls and have them choose between a white doll and a Black doll, almost in every instance, first of all the white children chose white dolls. And almost in every instance, Black children choose Black dolls. Why is that? What the Supreme Court concludes from this data is that it is the very nature of segregation alone that creates a sense of low self-esteem in these children, that they do not want to associate themselves with the Black doll, because in their mind what society has done is created this sort of view that Black is backwards, that Black is inferior. They see this in their daily lives. They don't have to go to school to see this, but that's where they see it as well. And because of this, the Supreme Court says this segregation retards the growth of these children. It actually slows it down, maybe backs it up. It retards their emotional growth, their psychological growth, their sense of well-being. But most importantly, it retards their intellectual growth. Well, how could this be? What if we know that in the 1950s, schools were not equally, they did not have the same stuff. They did not. We know that white schools had better facilities, better teachers, better programs than black students had. We know that. But what if we could give all of these children the same stuff? What if there were two schools and both schools had a mixture of children in them, right? And they were, in fact, racially mixed and mixed in all kinds of different ways, class and religion and what have you. And each side has the best teachers and the best books and the best computers and the best everything facilities. That we know is equal. However, if you keep all those goodies in place, if you keep all the material goods in place, the best books and best teachers and best sporting facilities and the best swimming pools and all of that, best computer labs, if you keep all that stuff in place, however, one group decides, because it is superior to the others, that it will be separate from them, that it will put them in another school, that very thing violates the 14th Amendment because of the effect that it has on the people who are being segregated out. It has this emotional and psychological effect. And besides, if this school system, which would segregate according to race, in fact is simply a microcosm of society, meaning it is simply one example of such segregation in the society, as it was in the 1950s, we know it wasn't just schools that were segregated. Everything in public accommodations were segregated in the South. So if children know this and they're going into a school, imagine you're a child in 1950 and you're going into a segregated school. You have been segregated out because those people are superior to you. Okay? Imagine that you still have the best teachers. You still have the best um, the best books and the best facilities. Would that would there be anything hindering your intellectual growth? Or would you just say, "Hey, I have the best school and the best teacher and the best this and the best that. I'm gonna go ahead and make it. I know I will." Well, most people won't think that way. And remember, and here we are with our 21st century minds. It's easier for us to go back and say, "Well, I would have done that and I would have done this." Here's the thing: in these schools in 1950, for example, children who are growing up in segregated schools, even if they do have good teachers, and even if they have good facilities, they know that once they graduate high school, especially in the South, what are they going to do? They're going to go down the road and work for somebody else, either on somebody's farm or in somebody's house as a domestic servant. So the question becomes, well, if you're sitting there as a student and I ask you, I'm your math teacher, and I say, "Hey, let's turn to page 50 of your math books." You're gonna be like, "Why would I even want to do that, teach? Why do I have to learn this stuff? I'm going to, in fact, go work over here on this farm. I'm not even sure I'm going to graduate high school. Why? Because the whole system is based on this idea of racial superiority and inferiority." And that very fact that again, what I'm getting at is this: is that the very fact that they are segregated out within this system of schooling, but within this larger social network, the social atmosphere, is that there is really not a whole lot of hope trying to learn something within a society that considers you so backwards and inferior that they don't even want to sit next to you. The Supreme Court says that school boards who do this are not only retarding the emotional and psychological growth of students, they are in fact retarding the intellectual growth of students. These kids won't care about education because of how you're treating them and because of what they know is in store for them once they leave here. The Supreme Court, must start somewhere, and it has to start here. And in fact, the Supreme Court says about education that education is the most important function of government, and therefore it must be provided equally. You know, this psychological and sociological data thing is going to be very, very difficult for a lot of people of the time to accept. These are at the time, new kind of ways of thinking, right? So it's going to be difficult for people to accept. But we have to accept, at least to some degree, the fact that I think that if you are constantly told you're inferior, that your self-esteem isn't going to be all that high, that you're going to struggle with it. Instead of having, for example, parents, even, I mean, just to kind of remove it from the race thing, what if you have parents who treat you as inferior? A family that does. It's going to be very difficult to deal with, right? Children need support. And so here we're dealing with things that children cannot change about themselves, their color. Color is a mark of inferiority. Separation from people who are colored is this idea of superiority. And what's interesting is I wasn't alive in the 1950s, but I'll tell you what's interesting is that, well, here, just a little personal thing. So some of you, I think they still have those Crayola boxes. Is it 64 crayons, I think, with the sharpener in the back, I think, right? All these different kinds of colors, a sharpener in the back. And of course, I always broke that sharpener. I was always trying to sharpen different things in there. My finger, mostly, my little pinky. But that that box of Crayola crayons used to have a color in it that today I believe is called peach. I I still remember seeing and and drawing, coloring, I should say, with crayons that at that time did not say peach, but which said skin tone. It actually said skin tone. What's that? What is that? What's the message that sends to children? I would not have really thought about this, but because it was just the way things were. I'm a brown-skinned man. I was coloring with a crayon called skin tone that didn't look like me. I didn't use the brown crayon. I always used that one. So, although this decision, Brown v. Board of Education, which is based on this, what people would call, soft or wishy-washy data, whatever, there's something to this. It is still a case that is, in fact, largely, it's going to be accepted on principle, but a lot of people will still sometimes, at least in legal communities, will say that it was decided in a really strange manner. It's like the court wanted this to happen. In fact, it's something that almost didn't happen. There's a guy named Earl Warren. Earl Warren was Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954. It is he who writes this opinion in 1954. Earl Warren will preside over the most progressive, liberal, whatever you want to call it, court in our history, up until the late 60s, early 70s. It is going to be his court that will be the court that changes our understanding of civil rights and civil liberties. It is through his court that we get civil rights decisions. It is through his court that we have the right to remain silent, that we have at the state level the right to an attorney in criminal proceedings that might land you in jail. It is through his court that you get things like the right to privacy, which of course also gets us things like birth control, and to some people, who don't like it, I mean, whether you like it or not, whatever your side you're on, it gets us privacy, but also gets us things like birth control and abortion. It is this court that, in the minds of some people, is going to be the champion of rights, and in the minds of others is going to be the destruction of U.S. values. Earl Warren is new to the court in 1954. He's there only because the guy before him dies. And Eisenhower, a Republican, appoints Earl Warren, also a Republican at this time. And by this time, it's already gotten more conservative, remember? Earl Warren will turn out to be one of the most progressive, radical, liberal justices we've seen in history. And Eisenhower, when he appoints him, by the way, didn't think this was going to happen. But when Earl Warren is appointed, he goes there and he knows that in the meantime, the other people, the other 8 guys on the court, and they were all guys, that they've been dealing with this case of Brown v. Board of Education. He comes in the middle of it pretty much, and he's like, hey guys, what are you guys working on? And they're like, oh, Brown v. Board of Education, we're about to uphold Plessy v. Ferguson. And he's like, what, are you nuts? Earl Warren had come out of California, where similar cases with regard to public education and segregation had actually been decided. He was the governor there when, in fact, it's really Mexican folk in California who were fighting this fight at the lower levels of school before black folk were fighting this fight. That's a whole different story. I bring that up only to show, in fact, that a couple things. One, that is that these struggles, the black struggle, the brown struggle, however you want to call it, these were all pushing for the same thing at the same time. The other thing is that Earl Warren saw these battles in his home state over school segregation, and he will eventually sign a law that outlaws school segregation in California in like 1947. He gets to the court in 1954, and he can't believe what he hears when they're like, yeah, we're okay with this. We're going to uphold Plessy v. Ferguson with regard to public schools. And he's like, no. He goes to each one of them and explains to them why they must change their minds. Those who were, in fact, not going to vote the way he thought they should. Those who were going to uphold Plessy, he's like, no. And this is why. And he explains to them all these things that he's already seen. He goes to all of them and convinces them. And he says, this is far too important for it to be an 8-1 or a 7-2 or a 6-3 decision. All 9 of us must be on board. And that's what happens. It overturns Plessy with regard to public education only. But a lot of people look at this case, especially at the time, and say this was wrong. Many people argue that this court has overstepped its bounds. The court is changing society, and nobody elects the court. These guys we know are nominated by the president and nominated by the president and selected by the Senate. These are unelected government officials who are telling us what to do. A lot of people who don't like what they just saw with Brown, they say, if you want to change society, call your congressman, write to him. The legislature can change it. Why is it that you guys, 9 of you, have decided this issue for the country? And in fact, when this decision is handed down, when Brown is handed down, there was no clear consensus on the issue segregation. In fact, most people were fine. Most people probably were fine with it, and a lot of people wanted it. So people would say, you are in fact, that is the court, engaging in social engineering. You are trying to change society from the bench, meaning from where they sit, right? That's the bench. So see, you're social engineering. You're changing society when society doesn't want to be changed. On the other hand, you may argue, no, we're not changing society. All we're doing is righting a wrong from 50-something years ago in Plessy v. Ferguson. They, that is the court in Plessy, they got it wrong. We're getting it right, finally. They misinterpreted the 14th Amendment to say separate but equal is equal, when in fact they were wrong. So we're not engaging in social engineering. We're simply telling you what should have been the case all along. And even if they were engaging in, even if you don't accept this argument, even if they don't accept that this is a better interpretation of the Constitution, a lot of people would say, was it social engineering? Yes, it was, but it was necessary because nobody was doing anything. At this point, we've seen Truman and we've seen FDR. Eisenhower, he's not a civil rights guy. He's president in 1950s, right? And he's president in 1954. Dwight D. Eisenhower. This guy's not doing anything. This guy is pretty well racist. Congress isn't really doing much. It is, in fact, up to the court to change things. Brown will be settled law. It will become a crucial symbol in the fight to end Jim Crow. 9 white men. They're all white. They're all old dudes. They're all men. They have told the country, you're going to change. And this is going to scare the heck out of a lot of people, and it's going to inspire a lot of people. And that's why it will become this crucial symbol in the 60s. And today, considered probably the most momentous Supreme Court decision of the 20th century. In fact, after Brown v. Board of Education is handed down, Congress, of course, at the federal level, starts to pass civil rights laws in other areas, wherever the federal government, in fact, rules, because it doesn't rule everything, right? Because states have their own rights, states have their own police powers, they have the right to say what they want happening in their own states to a degree. But where the federal government is in charge, it starts to pass civil rights laws to actually begin integration. So this is an important symbol. However, there's a problem with Brown. Several. One thing is that it's very limited in scope. It applies only to state schools. First of all, private schools can do what they want. So only state schools, meaning public schools. Private schools can still do what they want at this time. They can't do it today, but at this time, even after Brown, they could still segregate because they're private. Remember, the Constitution actually prohibits the state, meaning the government, whether it's your city or the federal government. It actually restricts the state from taking away your rights. So private schools can take away your rights. They don't have to have you. They can segregate all they want. And another thing is that really it only applies to schools. A state can't segregate in schools, but it can still segregate in other areas. It can still require segregation of swimming pools, of movie theaters, of restaurants, of libraries. You get the point. So it's very limited in scope. It applies only to state schools. Another thing that is that's hindering change even after Brown is that the Brown court does not offer any directives, meaning all it says is separate but equal is inherently unequal, and it gives all these reasons for that, but it does not tell states what to do or when to do it. It sets up no timetable. It doesn't say, well, here we are in 1954, and by 1964, you have to have, a certain mixture of students race-wise. It doesn't give them a timetable. It doesn't give them a plan. It doesn't say, this is how you do it, right? It doesn't say that you must take from this group over here to that group over there, that you have to start busing children. It doesn't say anything like that. So it doesn't really give any direction. So many school boards just ignore it. So it really does very little to end segregation of schools. Why is it so important? We have to understand that it's significant within the larger movement because it is part of a complex set of social movements and political movements. And it is really going to be the reaction to Brown that's going to actually be the basis for that's going to light the fuse. It is Brown in and of itself as a court case cannot on the ground really do anything, because remember, the Supreme Court cannot enforce its own laws. There's that as well. But it also, again, sets no timetable, no plan. So not a whole lot changes. But it is going to be Brown as a symbol that's going to, in fact, spark the civil rights movement. When Brown is first, let me just pop all these. Oh, no, I did not mean to do that. I knew I was going to do that. Okay. When Brown is handed down, public reaction is largely mixed. There's going to be some people who are cautiously optimistic. For example, one governor of, I think it was the governor of South Carolina, he says, I urge all of our people, white and colored, to exercise restraint, to preserve order, these kinds of things. He's like, let's just all try to get along. But then, on the other hand, you have promises, sheer promises of violence. We reject Brown. The governor of Georgia says, by the way, he says, look, there will never be mixed schools as long as I am governor. He says, attempts at school integration will result in bloodshed. And by the way, that's pretty prescient, meaning he can tell the future. So there will never be mixed schools, he says, as long as I am governor. And he says, Georgia will fight to manage its own affairs. Georgia will fight to manage its own affairs. What's this argument? It's this old argument of what? We all know it. States' rights. So you're going to have a lot of people rejecting it. Others kind of just seeing where the flow is going. Even some people in the black community reject it. Zora Neale Hurston. She lives in, I think, Orlando. She lives in Florida at the time. She's by now an authoress, famous author. I read her in college. Maybe you have, or you probably will. I hope you will. But she rejects this decision. She's a black woman. She's like, no. She says, this is wrong. You cannot force people to sit together. I don't want black children put in the position to where they're going to be harassed and maybe even killed. She basically says, why would we send our children into that situation? If you don't want us, we don't want you. She said, Plessy's fine. Separate but equal is fine. She said, that's the way to go. Just give us better schools. Give us better teachers. Make all of that stuff equal, which it wasn't. Make all that stuff equal and leave us the heck alone. So Zora Neale Hurston is like, no, separate is good. Kind of going back to Garveyism, right? This idea of separatism. The idea that black people and white people can never get along to the point where they can live side by side in peace. So there's this idea of separation. She said, let's just do that. Just we will take care of our own. In fact, she goes on and says, look, the Supreme Court and white people in this country, she says, they're just afraid that black people are gravitating to communism. Remember, all of that is happening in the 50s, right? The Cold War. She says this is pretty much just like this desperate attempt to keep them in their own circle, keep them from flowing or sort of gravitating to the communists. This is just a bone you're throwing them to keep them happy. You don't really mean what you're saying. Point is, a lot of people aren't sure what to make of this, but the court has spoken. And in the long term, the court is going to submit more rulings in new cases to explain Brown, to enforce Brown, to declare again and again that it is the law of the land. In 1955, the Supreme Court hears another similar case to this. And it says, okay, we didn't set out a plan or a timetable, but in this sense, in this case, what we're saying is that schools must desegregate, meaning integrate. They must bring students together. They must desegregate with all deliberate speed. Well, what does this mean? All deliberate speed. What does it mean to deliberate? What does it mean to be deliberate? If you look these words up, you'll see they don't really mean what maybe the court hoped it meant, or maybe it's hard to say. Here's the thing is, anybody can interpret this. All deliberate speed. Well, to be deliberate kind of means to be very painstaking and very careful about what you're doing. To deliberate also means, of course, to think about things. Yeah, I'm deliberating here. I'm acting with all deliberate speed. I'll get there. What's the point of this? This decision really doesn't do much to light a fire under anyone to make change. But it does anger people because the Supreme Court keeps saying the same thing. Now, desegregation is proceeding slowly, like molasses rolling down a dirt hill, because people don't have to do anything. However, the Supreme Court is making it clear that there's no going back, that integration will be the future of the nation. Here's the importance of Brown. It forces the issue onto the national stage. The country must face the issue of Jim Crow. On the one hand, it's going to embolden a lot of people who want change. It's going to embolden them to hit the streets and to demand more. The Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, one of the three branches of government, right, has spoken. At the same time, that very thing, that very movement that is emboldened by Brown is going to come up against fierce white resistance. It's going to embolden politicians in the South to move rightward. It's going to embolden white people in the South to engage in even worse violence, because it's going to create, it sort of creates this atmosphere of racial intolerance like never seen before, because people are not sure where the country's going. You got to understand that that white resistance in the South, and it happens in the North too, but it's mostly in the South, that people in the South believe that brown and what it stands for, integration, that it's really contrary to their way of life. It's contrary to every. I mean, think about this, guys. The Civil War was just the other day, right? Especially from the point of view of 1954, 55. They say brown is contrary to our way of life. Brown, because it involves the federal government, the federal court stepping on our freedoms, it's contrary to states' rights. Brown is contrary to states' rights. It's contrary to our way of life. The Supreme Court is attacking our way of life and states' rights. So you're going to see ordinary white folk resisting brown. You know, it's interesting because after World War II and during World War II, we did see instances, not always, but we did see a lot of instances in which poor people, both white and black, working class people, white and black, had joined each other in unions. And they realized that as a class, they had something in common. But after Brown, these groups begin to disintegrate. They separate along color lines. These groups like unions and these political organizations that had formed in the 1940s across racial lines, they're going to break down along racial lines. Poor and working class white folk in the South, they believe that their whole way of life is under attack. And so you're going to see a dramatic increase in violence. You're going to see bombings and shootings and lynchings spike. One of the saddest and perhaps, it's one of the most shocking killings involves a child named Emmett Till. Emmett Till, in 1955, he's about 14 years old. He's a black child who lives in Chicago, and he goes down to Mississippi to visit family. And his mother tells him, "Son, you know, Mississippi's different. You got to be careful." Well, this 14-year-old kid, he's kind of a big kid, and he's kind of a little bit brash. I don't really know. That's kind of the way he's described, but even by people around him, that, you know, he was not necessarily afraid all the time. He seems to have had a pretty decent sense of self-esteem, I suppose. But he goes into Mississippi, and I guess he's got cousins down there. And as the story goes, and we don't really know how this happened or whether this happened, but apparently he starts to kind of show off for his country cousins, right? And they go into a store, a local store, where he maybe whistles at a white woman who owns the store. Maybe some people say grabs her, which seems wholly unlikely. And then he goes home, right? So that's the story. Well, that night, Emmett Till, who was staying with his kin, right? I think they were aunt and uncle, right? Staying with his kinfolk. That night, wherein after this whistling or touching, groping supposedly happens, two brothers knock on the door of the home. They enter without being asked in. They push past everybody. They go in and they take Emmett Till, all the 14 years old, and they take him out to the woods, and they tie him down inside this old shed next to a river, and they go to work on him with tools. They torture him. They mutilate his body. And Before they toss him into a river, they take one of these huge industrial type fans, these, the spinning fans. They take barbed wire and wrap it around that fan and then wrap it around his neck and his body just to weigh him down, and they toss him into the river. So this is what he looks like after he's been done up, after he's been worked on to make him look better. This image is going to be it's going to be splashed across newspapers across the country. It's going to be broadcast into people's homes. 1955, more people are getting televisions. Even white folk who see this and think, well, I never would have wanted him to date my daughter, would still say, no, you do not do this to a 14-year-old kid. There's nothing he could have done to deserve this. And even what they said he did wasn't even close. When Emmett Till when his body is moved north, when it's transferred to the north, where they're holding his body, they want to, the people who are doing this for the family, they want to hold a closed casket, and the mother says no. She says the world needs to see what they did to my son, and they hold this open casket. And I'll tell you that there were thousands of people, tens of thousands of people who come and they walk by his casket. The line was out the door, down the street, around the corner, and back around the way to see this. It was mostly black folk, but there were also white folk. A good number of them who are disgusted by this whole thing. These two brothers are going to be tried by an all-white male jury. No surprise, they're acquitted, meaning found not guilty. Weeks later, to a reporter, they will brag about what they did. But you can't do anything because of this whole double jeopardy thing. You cannot be tried twice for the same crime. That's a very simple way of putting it, but you know what I'm talking about. They get away with murder, literally, and they laugh about it. In 2008 or so, just over 10 years ago, the woman who had accused him, she finally says she lied. She lied in court. But of course, by this time, I mean, talking about 50-something years later, please. She lied in court. Now, there was a plaque today by the river there where this happened. And every so often, that plaque is vandalized. Somebody shoots it up. It's happened a few times already. I think by now it's been replaced. It's been covered by bulletproof glass. But that's still happening down there in Mississippi. The KKK sometimes holds rallies right there where this happened. So, do Black Lives Matter? In 1955, I mean, look at that. And think about how people are commemorating, maybe even celebrating what happened. Holding rallies, shooting up the plaque. So this is one example of many instances of violence in the wake of Brown v. Board of Education. Violence perpetrated by people who don't want change. But it's not just ordinary white folk. I mean, ordinary white folk are getting more violent in the South, and because of this, Southern politicians, they know where their bread, which side their bread is buttered, right? They're gonna move hard right. If you are a politician in the South who does not support segregation, if you are for mixing, you're going to lose, and you lose again and again and again. And so what happens in the South is that they completely abandon any attempts to win black votes. These men, these politicians, want to make the majority of their constituents, meaning the majority of their voters, they want to make them happy. So they call for resistance to integration. I mean, this stuff is, I mean, this stuff, we see this today in the sense that you play to your base, right? That if the majority of voters want a certain something in your area, you give it to them. Doesn't matter how you feel, really. If you want to be a politician, this is what you do. So they call for resistance to integration. They make these public denouncements of integration. And they run on these very racist platforms in which they will promise segregation forever. They will say, don't worry about Brown v. Board of Education. I promise you, and this is the things that they say. They say, I promise you that if you vote for me, then that scary black man will never sit next to your pretty little daughter in a school, in kindergarten or whatever it is. So Southern politics is making a hard right turn here toward conservatism. We know that by this time, there's been a shifting of conservatives out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party. We're going to see another shift later on. And the people that are going to shift later on are going to be these same people who just reject, they completely hate, they abhor the changes that they see coming and the changes that they've seen made. In 1956, some 100 plus Southern congressmen, these are Congress people, right? They're in Congress. They actually say Brown was an abuse of judicial power. It went too far. The Supreme Court, no court is supposed to tell us how to run our society. It is an abuse of individual rights. I should be able to do what I want. I should be able to send my daughter to school and have her not sit next to a black guy. It is an abuse of states' rights. We should be allowed to pass laws requiring segregation. So they say Brown was wrongly decided. So here you have Congress up against another branch of government. So Congress, the highest branch of government in the legislative branch, right, going up against the Supreme Court. So they, in fact, promise massive resistance to Brown. This manifesto is a starting point for this hard move in the South, where these signers who signed the manifesto, they agree, we're going to go back to our respective states, to our own states. And in our states, we will work to ban the NAACP wherever it exists. Make it difficult for the NAACP, maybe even pass the law to make sure the NAACP cannot function properly. And they start doing that. They'll do things like require the NAACP to register the names of their members. Now, we've seen this at the federal level, sure, but now they're doing it at the state level, targeting NAACP and other civil rights organizations by making them publish the names of their members. Now, of course, if you publish the names of your members, that makes them targets. That means people might not want to be a member of your group. So that's the kind of thing that they plan to do, and they start to do. Another thing is that they start to close public schools in the South, because we know that Brown v. Board of Education really only touches on public schools. They start to close public schools. Of course, this means that Black children now have no schooling. In fact, when they close public schools in some of these areas, these people who closed them say to the Supreme Court, see what you made me do? You see what happened? It's your fault that these Black children who would have had some education are now getting no education. What about the white kids? Well, in these places where public schools are closed because of Brown, they start actually using tax dollars to pay for white students' tuition to private schools. This is a double whammy. They're using tax dollars taken from everybody. They don't care what color you are. They'll take your tax money. So they're taking it from everybody, but then using it only to educate the white students at private schools. Oh, I think I have a picture. So here's a student doing doing a little bit of might remind you of something. This is remote learning right here. She's learning on television, and interestingly enough, because of the schools having been shut down, and so some students are getting an education, but most Black children will end up working instead of going to school, because this sort of thing is extremely limited. The Supreme Court had already ruled that colleges, law schools were to be desegregated. Why was Brown so controversial? We've talked about this. One, it actually overturns the principle in Plessy of separate but equal. The prior decisions didn't do that. So the Brown decision takes a huge chunk out of Plessy, overturns the principle of separate but equal with regard to public schools. Let's remember that. But it attacks this principle. And so it takes a chunk out of Plessy. Other cases had not done that. The prior cases that we've talked about basically were saying, well, is Plessy being fulfilled by the school? Are they giving equal access of education and so forth? And the courts kept saying, no, they're not. Therefore, you must allow this Black person into your classroom. But again, if they had had separate facilities for Black law students or medical students, for example, then that would have been okay. But now this attacks that whole thing. Of course, what we're seeing here is very limited, though. Another thing is that it's not just that it attacks the principle of Plessy, but in fact, we're dealing with children. And we mentioned this before. We're not talking about people who are in law school at age 22, 23, who already, quote, know their place and know what's expected of them and know other people's places. We're not talking about them. We're talking about impressionable 5-year-olds who, God forbid, if they're sitting together, will actually think it's okay to be friends. See it. That's why it's so controversial. It strikes at the heart of segregation, Plessy, right? And it deals with impressionable children, because schools do more than teach you ABC 1, 2, 3. Schools socialize us. They socialize us into being who we are, into understanding who we are, situating us within a society. I read this book once. It was called Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. What'd you learn in kindergarten? Right? Share crayons, right? Sharing is good. Don't hit people. Don't lie, right? Nap time is good, right? You learn all of these soft skills. You learn to be friends with people, how to get along with others. And that is exactly what people in the South, Southern white people, are afraid of with Brown. But because of Brown, you have this whole group of people of the movement who are going to push forward. They're going to be backed by Brown, the Supreme Court, not really the president or Congress yet, but they're going to be backed by the Supreme Court. And this movement they're going to they're going to actually launch in the streets is going to lead to backlash. And it's going to be only violent backlash to Brown that will awaken the nation. Brown, by the late 50s, has become a powerful metaphor for Black liberation. One of the three branches of government dominated by white men was telling the country, you're going to change. Segregation is going to end. Racial change is coming. It has to. And because of this, we're going to see mass action in the 1950s, but also mass reaction in the 1950s. It's important to remember as we move forward that Brown does not cause the civil rights movement, but it catalyzes it. It's a catalyst, meaning that it really just kind of speeds it up. It gives new hope for civil rights to some and gives actually a lot of fear to others, really. Remember, these people who get this new hope for civil rights are going to combine this Brown decision, the sense that they get from the Supreme Court. They're going to combine it with all the stuff from the warriors and all the expectations and victories from the warriors. And so they're going to engage in new demonstrations. And these new demonstrations, this max action in the 50s, is going to result in a backlash of violence. In 1955, ooh, always too fast. In 1955, soon after that jury acquits the murderers of Emmett Till, Rosa Parks will refuse to sit at the back of a bus, and she will launch the modern civil rights movement. However, it's important to look at the background here. What do we know about Rosa Parks? What do we know about what came before? Very often, the way it was taught to me and the way my students tell me it was taught is that she was, Rosa Parks was this little old lady who was kind of sick and tired of being sick and tired, and finally stands up and shakes her fist at somebody and says, I will not move for you. That's a very uplifting message to tell kids. But it's not completely correct. Let's back up a little bit. In the wake of the Emmett Till murder and the subsequent acquittal of his murderers, in Montgomery, Alabama, you have a group that comes together and they are known as the Women's Political Council. The Women's Political Council decides that it needs to make a stand. It sees what happened one state over in Mississippi, and it believes that it has to make a stand somehow, somewhere, that this kind of thing cannot continue to go on, meaning the Emmett Till thing, and of course everything else that's going on. They plan to boycott city buses. Now, the buses in Montgomery, Alabama, actually rely very heavily on Black patrons, Black bus riders. Of course, the Black people have to sit at the back, and the way it would go, they didn't even want them walking. So the white folk would sit at the front of the bus, the Black folk at the back, but they weren't even allowed to pass the white folk on the way to the back of the bus. The way it would work is the bus driver, if he stopped for you at all, sometimes he didn't, if he stopped for you and you're a Black person, you get up, you pay the fee, and then you get off again, you get off, you go to the back of the bus and get on through the back. The bus driver didn't always stop for you. And sometimes even if you paid up front and started walking to the back, sometimes you just take off without you. So you took too long or something, took your money. So the Women's Political Council believes that this is going to be, the buses are a good place to start because the buses do rely heavily on Black usage. Even today in major cities, people of color, more than white folk, use buses. And there's a whole historical reason for that, which I think you can probably guess. The Women's Political Council is looking at this, and it realizes it needs a spark to get the people of Montgomery, Alabama riled up enough to resist, to boycott the bus lines. They're waiting for the moment, and they're waiting for the right person. In the spring of 1955, a young girl named Claudette Colvin is dragged from a bus by police because she refuses to sit in the back. She's kicking and screaming. She's 15 years old. This is in March of 55, so the spring, I suppose. Claudette Colvin refuses to give up her seat to sit in the back. She's dragged by police. The Women's Political Council looks at this and decides the time was not right. This 15-year-old is not going to be the face of their movement. They needed somebody else, not a 15-year-old girl, somebody else who could better, in their eyes, represent the movement. The Women's Political Council would settle on Ms. Rosa Parks, who at the time is in her 40s, and she's a bit matronly, meaning she's pretty conservative. She looks a little older. I always learned of her as a little old lady would tie her feet. She's not old. She's in her 40s. I know for some of you that's, 2 lifetimes away or whatever. But she's not old. But she is matronly. She dresses conservatively. She seems to act conservatively. Rosa Parks will refuse to give up her seat. She will become the face of the movement. She will be arrested. She would be the face of the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott will last for more than a year, where Black folk will walk or take taxis to get to work or school or whatever, rather than ride the buses. All of this will be coordinated by what's known as the Montgomery Improvement Association. I could have written that down, but the Montgomery Improvement Association. They're going to be the coordinators. The Montgomery Improvement Association will coordinate the boycott and will help Black folk get around the town without buses. They're going to walk, use bicycles, take taxis, whatever. Some of them are going to be helped by well-meaning white folk, in fact, who sometimes will drive carpools. You're going to see maids, teachers, students, farmers, all of these people, normal folk, engaging in a boycott. These are not educated folk as we understand it. They're simple folk for sure. Doesn't mean they're dumb. Point is, they're simple folk standing for their rights. Now, the city tries to shut down this whole thing. The city tries to shut down these carpools. It tries to say that they're illegal conspiracies in a sense. Don't worry about that too much. The point is they try to shut it down. They try to use the law because they try to force people back on the buses. But guess what? That's not happening. It doesn't work. White citizens threaten and they actually assault. They burn crosses in front of yards. They beat people. Still, these Black folk push forward. Bombs destroy Black churches. They destroy Black people's homes. Still, people boycott. And they do so peacefully. What we have here is a new tactic: nonviolence. Nonviolence, embedded, of course, within this term called civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is something that has long roots in U.S. history. Henry David Thoreau wrote about it. Civil disobedience. I think I talked about that. Maybe I didn't, but during the Mexican War, when he's jailed, he writes about civil disobedience. The idea of civil disobedience, of course, is to disobey the law, as you see, but to do it civilly, to do it peacefully, to not fight back. When you break the law, or when you break social norms and you are targeted for it, if you are hurt because of it, if violence is levied against you, you just take it. You disobey social norms as well as legal norms, but you do it peacefully. Of course, MLK Jr., we'll talk about him shortly, is at the heart of this. And this also harkens back to Mahatma Gandhi from the 1940s in India, 30s and 40s, where he was fighting through civil disobedience as well to free India from English occupation and colonialism. This nonviolence, this civil disobedience, is going to be a way to bring attention to the movement. How do people look when they say they believe in democracy and freedom, but they're beating you down and you're not fighting back? How do they look? It brings attention to the movement. It brings attention to the unjustness of the laws and the brutality of the surrounding society. So it's going to be a very powerful tactic. We will talk about this more. But it's going to combine with an old tactic, and that is the tactic of litigation, meaning using the courts. The Montgomery Improvement Association, in the middle of this whole boycott, will file suit in federal court, and this court case will go all the way to the Supreme Court in 1956. 4 women have stood up as plaintiffs in the case. 4 women who had been forced to sit at the back of the bus. Rosa Parks, by the way, she's not one of these 4 women. Claudette Colvin is, by the way. But Rosa Parks is not, because Rosa Parks still had charges against her for sitting on the bus. They were still trying to get her for that. So, trying to convict her. So there were still charges pending against her. And so she was not added as one of the plaintiffs, meaning one of the complainers on this case, because they didn't want to muddy the waters between what was going on with her case and what was going on with this case. They wanted a simple ruling. These women had been discriminated by the bus company in the past. This case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, oh, last year in Brown v. Board of Education, we talked about something similar to this. We looked at the 14th Amendment, and we decided whether or not the 14th Amendment was violated by racial segregation in public schools. And we said yes. And guess what? Today we're going to extend that. So this is an extension of the Brown decision in a sense. It hasn't anything to do with schools. It has everything to do with transportation. Also has everything to do with this idea of inferiority, superiority. So you see that the change is coming. The 14th Amendment, according to this court in Gale v. Browder, is violated. The Equal Protection Clause is violated when the city discriminates on city buses. These are city buses. In a prior case, you may recall, the Supreme Court had held that buses that cross state lines cannot be segregated by law by states. The states can't do that because they cross state lines. That, of course, had everything to do with the Commerce Clause and the fact that the states, in actually segregating people according to race on buses that cross interstate lines, were actually stepping on Congress's Commerce Clause power to regulate business that cross state lines. That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is a pure rendering of the 14th Amendment, of what it means. I want to talk a little bit more before we go on about Rosa Parks. I kind of just left that hanging out there. Rosa Parks, who's 40 years old, matronly, was not just a little old lady with tired feet who shakes her fist at the world. That's a very inspiring story. We like the idea of the little guy standing up. But in fact, Rosa Parks is a veteran of civil rights politics in the South. She's actually in Alabama the secretary of the local NAACP chapter. She has standing. She's not just a seamstress, as it was taught to me, a seamstress, right? Which she did, sew stuff, but that's not all she was. She was a secretary of the local NAACP. She was also an anti-rape crusader for Black women. She is a veteran of Black civil rights, been trained in civil rights. So she's more than this little old lady with tired feet. So in a sense, this story, and I would be surprised if all of you, some of you may, but if all of you knew the reality, I would be surprised that she was this mover and shaker within the civil rights movement. A lot of my students are even surprised that she wasn't the first. We've already seen others be dragged off buses. We talked about this already, not just with Claudette Colvin, but we talked about this in the past. Even Sojourner Truth, remember, had an issue with this when she was on a Black streetcar, or excuse me, on a streetcar, and was forced to get off because she was not in the Black area. So Rosa Parks was not the first. Why is it that we forget these others? We like this idea of a champion, sure, and all that. Why are these others not held up to the same degree? And of course, it's because what comes right after, right? And that is the movement is sparked, as we'll see. But we have to give credit to these others. By telling the story the way it is traditionally told, a little old lady with tired feet, we actually take something away from her. Not only do we take away also with her story, we take away from the people who came before her, but we take away from her story as well. Think about it. What takes more guts? To one day just stand up and shake your fist at the world and decide you're not going to move? We've all had that feeling, maybe. Maybe we've acted on it, maybe we haven't, maybe we wish we had. We can, and we understand that. What's harder though? That just standing up one day and snapping, we've all snapped probably at somebody or another and yelled. What's easier, that or getting up every day as a member of the local NAACP, living in a state that is trying to get rid of people like you, that is trying to get rid of the NAACP, and which hates people like you, not only because you're Black, but because you are a troublemaking Black person, as they would see it. So when we tell the story of her as being this little lady with entire feet and all that kind of stuff, we miss all of the importance of what she actually had to do every day. But it is her face that is the face of the boycott. And this boycott is significant because it reflects a two-pronged strategy: litigation, use of the courts, and civil disobedience. As we said, the court in Gale v. Browder will take a hunk out of Plessy. Brown dealt with schools, Gale with buses. In the Gale case, just like the Brown case, was not based on the Commerce Clause. It's based on the 14th Amendment. Then, of course, civil disobedience, which brings attention and support. In the North, you're going to see black people, not just white people, for sure. Not just black people, but white people, for sure, actually paying attention. And you're going to see black people in the North. Remember, they had flown north, not flown, but they had fled north in a sense, almost as refugees, I suppose, during the wars. They still have Southern ties, but those ties are going to be strengthened because of this bus boycott. A lot of individuals and a lot of groups expressed their support during this boycott, and they donate shoes and clothing and money and everything to the boycott. Money for sure, clothes and shoes and all that for the walking, right? Jewish groups, Quaker groups, these are not black people, they give money, they give legal support for this boycott. National newspapers are spreading all of this stuff around. And internationally, a lot of people are watching to see what the nation does. A nation that talks about democracy and freedom, a nation that is engaged in a Cold War, is it going to do to its own people what it says others shouldn't do to their people, what other countries shouldn't do? So this civil disobedience is bringing attention nationally, internationally. Black people are willing to get beaten for their rights. Meanwhile, the images of Emmett Till are still in the minds of a lot of people. And you're going to have a lot of people paying attention because of television. The Montgomery bus boycott is a turning point. It really marks the launch of a non-violent crusade for civil rights, one that is based in the South, not the North. It had for a long time been thought that once the movement really takes hold, once it gets going, it starts trucking, rolling down the hill, that in fact it will be Northerners, educated black folk, who will be doing the deed, who will be engaged in this. We've seen W.E.B. Du Bois and a lot of groups like that. But in fact, the 60s civil rights movement that explodes in the streets is going to come out of churches, regular church folk. It's a grassroots movement. Grassroots just means from the bottom up. These are not going to be the educated, elite, middle-class black folks. Most of them are going to be ordinary people, some middle class for sure. MLK, for example. But they're going to be just normal church folk. So this is going to be a turning point for nonviolent crusade. It's also going to be a turning point in the life of MLK Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. will become president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and he will lead the group through the boycott. And he will tie, in doing so, he's going to do something very important. He's going to tie the black experience to the nation's values. He is not rejecting the nation. He's just saying the nation needs to embrace him as much as he embraces the nation. He ties the black experience to democracy and respect for the U.S. Constitution. He says, you're not going to find any of us that are going to be opposing the U.S. Constitution. We are, and what we're doing, in fact, trying to fulfill the U.S. Constitution. He's going to tie the movement to patriotism. He's going to say, we love this country. We love what it stands for. We love what it stands for in the world with its push against communism. Notice communism creeps in here. He's going to tie the black experience to democracy and patriotism, but he's also going to tie the movement itself. And by the way, he's tying the movement to democracy and patriotism, but he's also tying it to Christianity. Christian love. WWJD. What would Jesus do? He's going to tie it to the fight between right and wrong, good and evil, the dark forces versus the righteous forces. And of course, within this idea of Christianity, turning the other cheek. What would Jesus do? Jesus wouldn't strike back. Nonviolence and civil disobedience are going to be part, he brings this in, he will talk about how it must be part and parcel of their movement. Now, you should know, Martin Luther King Jr. and others in the movement, they're not averse to violence. They're not totally against it as a means, as a principle. They just know it's not going to get them anywhere. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine being someone who's okay with fighting back, but you don't because you know it's worth it? In fact, if you fight back, it makes the others more powerful. It gives them more reason to come at you. It scares others around you who otherwise would have been on your side. So King and others, they're not against violence as a matter of principle. They just know there's a better way to do it, and this way won't get them anything at all. They're not giving up on self-defense. There's a long tradition of Black self-defense, as we've seen. All these people, in fact, have guns in their houses. If not all of them, by far most of these people who are engaged in the movement will hold guns in their houses. How could they not? The police aren't on their side. Other activists will warn that they will use guns to protect the nonviolent protesters who themselves are choosing not to protect themselves. So this nonviolence thing is interesting. It's a tactic, right? But it is important also because it shows that these people are willing to be beaten. They're willing to be beaten to defy laws they believe to be unjust. And they believe they're doing so because those same laws violate the Constitution. So they take it back to the Constitution. MLK Jr. says, look, if we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, then Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer and never came down to earth. What he's saying is that if we are wrong, then everything about us is wrong, about this country is wrong. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. So he is very keen to draw this connection between God and country and the movement. So he's going to embed Christianity into the civil rights movement. He was a reverend after all. But Christianity will be the sort of organizing principle for the civil rights movement, at least this movement. We know that religion is going to be crucial to many movements. Religion is an important organizing principle. It is a good way to get people to rally around you. So the use of religion has its benefits here. It's also going to be beneficial for them because Christians are not going to be easily red-baited. They're not going to be easily called communists. They're Christians after all. Secular organizations, secular meaning non-religious, they're often called communistic. Why? Just because they are not religious. Remember, I might have mentioned this, maybe not, but communists in the tradition of communism are in fact atheists. If a union or other civil rights organization does not outwardly proclaim its Christianity, it is a target for being called communistic because the communists are atheists. And if you're secular, you're just one step removed in the eyes of many observers. So it's harder to call groups of church folk communistic, especially when they say that they stand for everything you stand for as a nation. Those people, you meaning those people who would oppose them. Based on this idea of Christianity and the movement being intimately connected to each other, King is going to form a new religion-based civil rights organization. It will be known as the Southern Christian Leadership Council, and it forms in 1957. This SCLC is going to be church-based. And as I said, it's going to be the church folk that are going to be the soldiers in this battle on the front lines, at least in the early years. The Southern Christian Leadership Council is going to have as its major goal voting rights. Voting rights. And meanwhile, public school integration in the South is moving very, very slowly, if at all. Now, in some places in the South, tensions are not all that hot. There are incidents, of course, in places like what used to be called the Chesapeake, right? Virginia, Maryland, the Upper South. However, it is in the lower South, the deep South, where we're going to see increasing conflict, even in some southwestern states. Many school districts that do integrate, you're going to see a lot of Black parents actually refusing to subject their children to what they know is coming. They're fearing what will happen. They see what is happening to other children. We know that young Black students who enter previously all-white schools, they're taunted, they're threatened, they're assaulted. Most of the students who are sent to integrate are women. They're usually young women. They are typically raised in the church, very devout, better able usually than males, young men, to withstand the onslaught, the attacks, the taunts, the threats, the constant pressure. A notable example of all of this pressure and the attacks and the taunting is, it happens in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. In Little Rock, Central High School has been ordered by a federal court to integrate. The school board had been doing next to nothing to integrate. Now, the Supreme Court, we know in Brown v. Board of Education, had set out this all deliberate speed thing. That just means that, we don't really know what it means, as we mentioned, but certain lower courts under the Supreme Court were actually interpreting those words, some in a very positive way, if you like integration, right? Some in a very negative way, if you like integration. In Little Rock, the federal court that actually has jurisdiction over Little Rock said, look, Central High School, you're doing way too little. So they demand, that is the court, orders the school to integrate. And what happens is that the community needs volunteers. And 9 Black children are going to be sent to integrate Little Rock High School, Central High School. They're going to be 6 girls and 3 boys. Now, they're doing it with their parents' permission because, again, not everybody wants to subject their children to this. When these kids arrive at the high school, they're confronted by a howling, screaming, cursing mob of white folk, children, women, grown men. Meanwhile, the governor of Arkansas, a guy named Orville Faubus, doesn't matter, the governor, this guy calls in the National Guard to prevent integration. So not only do these students encounter this huge mob of people just yelling and screaming at them, they are actually going to encounter the state's National Guard. When they arrive, these children are not allowed to enter. The guards raised their bayonets against the black students. Meanwhile, this white crowd is out there yelling things like lynch her, lynch her. There was a young girl named Elizabeth Eckford, by the way. She's one of them. But they're yelling to lynch her. And they're, of course, throwing N-words left, right, and center. Now, if you look at one of these pictures, oh no, I always do that. One of these pictures here. So Little Rock 9 on the left there you see. And then bottom right, you will see the young girl there. I think that is Elizabeth Eckford. I could be wrong, but the young black girl in the glasses there. And then over her left shoulder, which is, of course, from our perspective on the right side, over her left shoulder, there's a young white woman just screaming in her ear. I can't remember that woman's name. Recently, a couple of years ago, she was interviewed. This white woman was interviewed. She's a lot older now, obviously. She was a young woman then, maybe even a student. And she said she looks at that picture and she doesn't see herself anymore. She can't understand how she could have been a part of that. Now, whatever you think about this, excuse, rationale, whatever, it does speak in a sense to the mob mentality that was pervasive in a lot of these places. It's easy to go along. So whatever you think of that, you know, she said she felt bad about it. Now, when this is happening, President Eisenhower steps in. Now, he's a Republican. This guy does not like the idea of integration, right? He does not like it. He has already denounced Brown v. Board of Education. He did not like what the Supreme Court has done. And part of it, you know, is first of all, he is racist like hell. But part of it is that he does believe that it was too much too soon. And he does not like the fact that it was his guy, Warren, right? Earl Warren, the guy that he chose to sit on the Supreme Court, to sit as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He does not like that this guy is the one who changed everything. President Eisenhower steps in. He will see, and you got to ask yourself, well, why does he step in if he has these ideas about race, right? Well, he sees all the furor. He sees especially the international furor. There are accusations of hypocrisy around the world. This is what you call, quote, American democracy. And the Soviet Union is actually using this also in their own propaganda campaign worldwide. Remember, this is the height of the Cold War. We're talking 1957. So Eisenhower realizes this is an embarrassment for the United States. And it is, in fact, you know, it allows people to say, you know, you are not just a hypocrite, right? But you are no better than anybody else. Kind of like what we saw with the Zoot Suit riots, right? The Zoot Suit riots in the 1940s, right? 1942, 43, something like that. What happens, of course, is the Germans were able to use all of that against the United States. The Nazis were able to use that. They were like, why are you getting on us for treating our people wrongly, people within our borders? Not really our people, they wouldn't have said that, but treating people within our borders the way we do. Mind your own business. Look at what you're doing back home. So this is a constant theme. We saw it during the Zoot Suit riot. We're seeing it here during the rise of the civil rights movement. But to his credit, at least, he sends in the troops. Dwight D. Eisenhower actually sends in the federal troops. I think they were airborne troops. I don't really remember. And at the same time, he nationalizes the Arkansas National Guard, which means he's in control of them. The governor is no longer in control of them, and that's constitutional. It's in the Constitution. Yes, he can. It's in the Constitution. Yes, he can do that. These troops, as you can see in the top right picture, will end up having to escort these children amidst a howling mob of people. What's interesting too is that Ike, when he does this, he gives a speech about how there is, in fact, a link between civil rights agitation, what these people are doing to integrate. There is a link between civil rights, the civil rights movement, and democracy. These people are fighting for democracy. This is, of course, going to give fuel and cover to the civil rights leaders and people involved in the civil rights movement. For months, these Black students are going to be escorted to their classrooms, to school. They can't really go into classrooms, but they go into the schools with them. They walk them home. They walk them to school. These agents are white men. These are men who are doing their jobs, sworn to protect them. And there are instances in which it is very clear that they sympathize with these children. There's a podcast that I've provided for you. Make sure you listen to that. You hear about one instance where one of these girls, a Black child, has acid thrown in her face or some sort of chemical thrown in her face. And the guy who was in charge of protecting her, she didn't even know what had just happened, right? She was like, oh my God, what just happened? You know how it is. And something happens to you, like you're just trying to process it. But the guy who was in charge of protecting her, he just kind of snatches her up really brusquely. And he just carries her over to a water fountain and washes out her face, washes out her eyes. To this day, she says she would have been blinded if not for him. So what's the significance of all of this? Well, a bunch of different things here, but President Eisenhower's action will give fuel to the movement. He has seemingly sanctioned their actions, made like put a seal of approval. That he has tied democracy and the fight for civil rights. Now, of course, others had been saying it before him, for sure, but he's the president. What the president says matters. Or at least it used to. I don't know about anymore. Anyway. And it sends another message. The federal government will use force to enforce integration. Now, it's going to use force only because the court, really what it's doing is upholding, not upholding so much as executing the law by the courts. Remember, as the chief executive, the executive branch, of course, executes the laws. As the chief executive, it is his job, that is the president, to enforce these laws. So he sends the message. Now, he didn't have to do this. He could have sat back and a lot of the country would have gone right along with him. But he sends the military. He is the head of the country, and he realizes this has to be done, whether he personally likes the idea or not. The courts have spoken. It is up to him to enforce the law. We haven't always seen that in history where a president will necessarily uphold the court's law, enforcing it, I mean. Don't always see that. Most of the time you do. He didn't have to do that here. So he sends a message. We're going to enforce what the courts say. And the courts are saying integration, we're there. Of course, this is going to ignite the states' rights people like never before. Because now they're able to dust off that old argument. I mean, not that they haven't already, with, of course, the manifesto by all those representatives. Excuse me. Excuse me. Oh my goodness, sorry. The Southern Manifesto, where 100 plus representatives had signed and agreed to oppose Brown and integration. We talked about that. So they're already on the states' rights bandwagon. Of course, this is the argument that they used to keep slavery in place. So they're saying here we have our own National Guard and we're trying to do our own thing. The governor has ordered the National Guard to keep this school from being integrated, and the big bad federal government has come in with its overwhelming force and its jackbooted thugs coming in here to take over our state. So a lot of people in the South, of course, are clinging to the states' rights argument. It is something that they can use, much as people still use with regard to the Civil War. Things are changing. By the end of the 1950s, this is clear that things are changing. They're changing politically, they're changing legally, they're changing socially. And they really are changing culturally. All of these things that we've been talking about with Brown and with the Little Rock Nine and so forth, all of this is happening against a backdrop of cultural change, cultural diffusion. That's just a fancy way of saying that culture is actually, people's cultures are affecting each other. During the 1950s, the United States is going to experience a boom in mass culture: movies, television, sports, and music. And music is perhaps the most important platform for cultural diffusion. I would say even today, considering what we see with, the appeal of hip hop and rap and so forth. It didn't really start with rock and roll, but the rock and roll boom of the 50s, I think, is a major turning point with regard to this cultural diffusion. It is a moment in time where rock and roll, born in the 1950s, actually having come out of the black culture, is going to be not only celebrated by white folk, but absorbed by white culture. Rock and roll music actually comes out of the gospel movement. It comes out of church music. And even among these church folks, the older black church folks, they don't like rock and roll. They think it's ungodly. A lot of people who kind of break from gospel into the mainstream rock and roll movement, they're going to be looked down upon. But they're gonna happen anyway. They're gonna do their own thing. This is the 50s, man. You're gonna see people like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, top left-hand corner here. I like to call her the grandmother of rock and roll. She was a jamming guitarist since she was a young girl. I have listed a bunch of YouTube videos. Make sure you watch them. They're just short clips. They're really fun to watch, I think. Watch them with an older person. I think they'll get a kick out of it if they were alive at that time, especially. But Sister Rosetta Tharpe was an amazing guitarist, and she actually was jamming before these other major artists even knew what rock and roll was. Take a look at her. She's pretty bad. And then, of course, we have people like Little Richard. And Little Richard is the guy right there in the middle. We have people like Chuck Berry on the top right, people like Chubby Checker doing the twist on the left bottom. And then, of course, we have Elvis Presley. Now, Elvis Presley is going to, of course, be a cultural icon. But where does he get his shake? Where does he get his music? He goes into the black clubs of Memphis, where he learns the music. He learns the lingo, he learns the suaveness, he learns all that stuff, and he learns how to shake it. In fact, when he goes on the Ed Sullivan show, Ed Sullivan was a very famous show in the 1950s. They would showcase all this talent, right? Different kinds of talent. When he goes on, he's got to go on there because they're going to have him because he's so big. But they refuse, in fact, to film him shaking his waist, his pelvis, from the waist down. They don't film him from the waist down because they thought it was lewd at the time. And it was also considered very, very black. So it was not something that white culture as a mainstream whole was ready for, but the young people were loving it. They had never seen a white man shake it the way this guy shook it. When you watch his clip, notice when he's there, he kind of starts to gyrate a little bit, then he'll stop, right? Because it's kind of his way of poking fun at the fact that everybody knows what's going on here, right? Everybody knows by the time he gets onto the Ed Sullivan show, he's not going to be allowed to shake it as much as he wants, and they start filming him in some places again from the waist down. Point is, rock and roll changes everything. And depending on who you ask, a lot of people will say rock and roll really comes out, the term rock and roll, I should say, initially was not really something that was used for music, but it was actually a reference to drugs and sex, right? We're going to rock and we're going to roll. So the term rock and roll, though, will gain currency with regard to music in the 1950s. A guy named Alan Freed, by the way, he was a DJ in Cleveland, where I grew up, and he's the one that coins the term rock and roll, which is why the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is in Cleveland, Ohio now. It's they say the birthplace of rock and roll, but that's debatable depending on where you really think this stuff started, right? Now, when these black musicians, Rosetta Tharpe and Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and all that, those guys are on the scene very early on, before even, and of course Elvis Presley comes on shortly. But the parents, they are shocked. They are astounded. Their kids are going to see, not only they're listening to these artists, right, their records, but they are going to these concerts where these guys play, and they think it's too close for comfort. The black guys are on stage, the black girls are on stage shaking it, the guys are on stage shaking it, right? There's no real race mixing going on in the early years, but it's too close for comfort for parents who know that their kids are going there and screaming their heads off for black people. When they're being kind, the parents will call it race music, right? Not because it's fast, but because it's black. Now, when I was growing up, people still said this about hip hop, rap. I don't know that this happens it certainly doesn't happen as much as it used to when I was growing up. People wondering, why are you listening to that black music? That kind of thing. They would call it jungle music or, other kinds of things, right? As you can imagine. And so, but it doesn't happen as much anymore. But still, it's still the case. A lot of kids, even today, probably hear this from the grandparents at least. At this time, and these are probably grandparents who grew up maybe in the 50s, but not everybody in the 1950s was on board with this. There was still a lot of conservatism. Remember that. So there's a lot of people who grew up in this era who didn't like what they were seeing. The parents, for sure, did not like the idea of race mixing. Their kids going into clubs. This is at a time when the black artists would have to enter through a back door. They couldn't be on the floor, and they couldn't go through the front door. They were coming in through the back door. White artists could come in through the front door, but black artists had to come in through the back door, and the white kids are actually there on the floor shaking it to their rhythms. These are the teenagers. The term teenager gains currency. Teenager was not really a word until the 1950s, right? I mean, not to say it never existed, but certainly that's this cultural moment when people say there is such a thing as a teenager. And these kids have lots of money because of the war years, and because they're young, they're more open to change. And these will be the same kids that are going to be on college campuses of the 1960s. They're going to be marching in the streets for a variety of reasons and a variety of rights, not just people of color, but for women and for young people. Now, we have to stop and say, look, much of this seems to be happening. This cultural diffusion seems to be happening in urban areas and in suburban areas of the North, not so much in the South. In the South, most people are still clinging to the old ways, but it will be there that the movement will explode. Okay, we will leave it there for now. Next time, we'll talk about the boom in the 60s. Take care.